In the unforgiving winter of 1888, a man searching for solitude found something he never expected. In the heart of the Colorado Rockies, inside a cabin buried by snow, lay a sight that would freeze the blood of the hardiest soul, a baby silent, still, and ice-cold to the touch. He was a trapper, a man more comfortable with the dead than the living. But in that moment, he faced a choice that would redefine his existence. This isn't just a tale of survival. It's the story of a life that began at what should have been its end, and a broken man who discovered his own humanity in the faint, impossible heartbeat of a child who would call him Papa before the spring ever came. The wind that scoured the San Juan Mountains in the winter of 1888 wasn't merely a force of nature, it was a malevolent entity. It screamed through the jagged peaks and clawed at the ancient pines, its voice a symphony of desolation. For Jedediah Stone, the sound was a familiar, if unwelcome, companion. At 43, his face was a road map of hardship, etched with the scars of a life lived on the fringes. A failed prospector, a reluctant bounty hunter, and now a solitary trapper seeking refuge from memories as harsh as the blizzard itself. His past was a ghost that rode the icy gales, a ghost with the face of his wife Martha and their stillborn son, taken by a fever that had swept through the mining camp near Leadville 3 years prior. He had fled civilization, then trading the cacophony of human grief for the stark, honest cruelty of the wilderness. Here survival was the only prayer, and the silence that followed was a balm on his fractured soul. He was tracking a silver fox, its pelt a small fortune that could see him through to the thaw, when the blizzard descended with a sudden blinding fury. The world dissolved into a maelstrom of white. Disoriented, his horse Boudica whinnying in protest, Jedediah knew his own small cabin was miles away and unreachable. To stop was to die. He pressed on, trusting the instinct that had kept him alive this long, his eyes scanning the blur for any sign of shelter. That's when he saw it, a faint, almost imperceptible smudge of grey against the white. A wisp of smoke, thin and desperate, struggling to escape a snow-choked chimney. Hope, a dangerous and unfamiliar sensation, flickered in his chest. A cabin, another soul braving the desolation. It took him the better part of an hour to reach it, the snowdrifts clutching at his legs like greedy hands. The cabin was small, crude, and half-buried, an abandoned line shack by the looks of it. But the smoke meant life, or at least a recent fire. "Hello," he bellowed, his voice swallowed by the wind. "Anyone in there needin' shelter from the storm?" There was no answer. The silence from within was more profound than the roar of the wind outside. A knot of unease tightened in his gut. He dismounted, tying Boudica to a low-hanging branch where she'd have some meager protection from the wind. Pushing through a drift that reached his waist, he shoved the heavy, warped door. It creaked open, complaining into the storm. The interior was cast in a dim grey light from a single, grimy window. A fire in the stone hearth had dwindled to a bed of sullen, glowing embers, the source of the smoke he'd seen. The air was frigid, thick with the smell of burnt pine, and something else, something metallic and wrong. His eyes adjusted to the gloom. A rough-hewn table, a single chair overturned, and a crude cot in the corner. His gaze was drawn to a bundle of furs and rags piled on the cot. He assumed it was a traveler's pack left behind in a hurry. He moved towards the hearth first, his survival instincts overriding his curiosity. He needed to get the fire going. As he knelt, coaxing the embers with tinder from his satchel, the strange silence of the bundle began to bother him. He glanced over his shoulder. It was utterly still. Too still. Fire re-established a small lick of flame, casting flickering shadows across the room. Jedediah rose and walked cautiously towards the cot. He reached out a gloved hand and gently pushed back the top layer of rabbit fur. The world stopped. The scream of the wind, the crackle of the fire, the frantic beat of his own heart, it all faded into an immense, silent void. It was a baby. Its skin was a pale, waxy blue, tinged with a terrifying translucence. Its tiny face, framed by a few wisps of downy blonde hair, was peaceful, its eyes closed as if in sleep. A small, perfect hand, no bigger than his thumb, lay unclenched on the furs. There was no rise and fall of its chest, no fog of breath in the frigid air. It was a porcelain doll, beautiful and lifeless. Jedediah recoiled as if struck. A wave of nausea and a grief so profound it felt like a physical blow washed over him. Martha. His son. The cabin became a tomb, and he was an intruder in a scene of unspeakable tragedy. He saw a dark stain on the floor near the cot, partially obscured by shadow. Blood. His mind pieced together a grim, frantic narrative, a mother perhaps injured or dying, desperately trying to keep her child warm, before succumbing herself. But where was she? He scanned the small room again. No one else was there. He should leave. This was a place of death, a place of sorrow he had tried so hard to escape. He should turn, walk out the door, and take his chances with the storm. It was not his burden. But he couldn't move. His eyes were fixed on the tiny, still form. He had seen death. He knew its face, its stillness, its finality. And yet, something held him, an irrational, insane flicker of the same hope that had led him to the cabin. Slowly, as if in a trance, he pulled off his glove. His calloused, weather-beaten fingers, trembling slightly, reached out and touched the baby's cheek. The skin was shockingly cold, like touching marble in a graveyard. He felt for a pulse in the delicate neck, his fingers clumsy and huge against the tiny throat. Nothing. He pressed his ear to the baby's chest, listening past the frantic drumming in his own ears for a sound that wasn't there. Silence. It was over. The child was gone. A profound sadness settled over him, heavier than the snow on the roof. He stood up, a ragged sigh escaping his lips. He would give the child a proper burial, he decided. It was the only decent thing to do. When the storm broke, he would find a place beneath the pines. As he began to pull the furs back over the still face, his thumb brushed against the baby's lips. And in that moment, in the heart of the frozen silence, he felt it. A twitch. It was so faint, so infinitesimally small, he was certain he had imagined it. A trick of his own shivering hand, a phantom of his desperate hope. He froze, holding his breath. He stared unblinking at the pale mouth. And then he saw it. A tiny, almost imperceptible flutter of the lips, followed by the faintest, shallowest puff of air, a ghost of a breath that barely disturbed the chill. The baby was Elle. The discovery sent a jolt through Jedediah, a current of pure, unadulterated panic that momentarily paralyzed him. Alive. The word was an absurdity, a rebellion against the laws of nature as he understood them. He had held the coldness of death in his hand, and yet life stubbornly, impossibly clung on. His paralysis shattered, replaced by a frantic, primal urgency. Every instinct honed by years of surviving the wilderness recalibrated to a new, singular purpose, to fight the encroaching frost that held this child in its grip. "All right, little one," he murmured, his voice rough and unused to softness. "All right, Jedediah. Don't you go losing your head." He worked with a speed and precision born of desperation. He stoked the fire, piling on wood, until it roared with a defiant heat, pushing back the cabin's oppressive chill. The room, once a tomb, began to glow with a warm orange light. He knew direct heat would be a shock to the system, could even kill her. It had to be slow, gradual. He stripped off his heavy outer coat and laid it by the hearth, letting it soak up the warmth. He then turned his attention back to the child, his movements now surprisingly gentle. He carefully unwrapped her from the cold, stiff furs. She was a girl, he realized, clad in a simple linen shift that was thin and wholly inadequate. Her limbs were stiff, her skin mottled and terrifyingly cold. But she was alive. He could see the shallow, infrequent breaths now, each one a tiny miracle. "Came into this world fightin', didn't you?" he whispered, a strange ache in his chest. "We ain't gonna stop now." He stripped away her cold garment and wrapped her in his own undershirt, which was still warm from his body heat. Then he did the only other thing he could think of. Taking the pre-warmed coat from the hearth, he sat with his back against the rough-hewn wall, opened his own shirt, and placed the tiny cold bundle directly against his skin. He pulled his coat and a collection of blankets from his bedroll around them, both creating a cocoon of shared warmth. The initial contact was a shock, her coldness seeping into him, a stark reminder of how close to the edge she was. He held her tight, his own body, a furnace willing his life force into her. The hours that followed were a long, silent vigil. The blizzard raged outside, a monstrous, thwarted beast. Inside there was only the crackle of the fire, the rhythm of Jedediah's own breathing, and the desperate hope for the same from the child in his arms. He didn't sleep. He didn't move. He just held her, murmuring nonsensical words of encouragement, stories of sunshine. He could barely remember promises of a warm spring morning. He was talking more than he had in 3 years. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, a change began. The terrifying chill of her skin began to recede, replaced by a cool dampness. He felt a tremor run through her tiny body, a shiver that was not his own. It was a good sign. Her body was fighting. He risked a glance down. The waxy blue pallor of her skin was slowly, painstakingly giving way to a more natural, albeit still deathly pale hue. Her breathing, while still shallow, became more regular. Sometime near dawn, as the fury of the storm began to abate, replaced by a weary sighing of the wind, it happened. A sound. It started as a faint, pained whimper, a kitten's mewl. Jedediah's heart leapt into his throat. He held his breath, listening. The whimper grew, gaining strength until it blossomed into a full-throated, lusty cry. A sound of outrage, of hunger, of life itself. It was the most beautiful sound Jedediah had ever heard. Tears, hot and unexpected, welled in his eyes, freezing on his weather-beaten cheeks. He hadn't cried when Martha died. He hadn't cried when he'd buried his son. His grief had been a cold, hard stone in his gut. But this cry, this sound of a life reclaimed from the jaws of death, broke him. He wept silently, his shoulders shaking, holding the wailing infant to his chest as if she were the most precious thing in the world. And in that moment, she was. The next few days were a blur of clumsy, terrified fatherhood. The immediate crisis was over, but a new set of challenges emerged. She was hungry, desperate. Jedediah, a man who knew how to skin a buck and set a trap, was utterly clueless about feeding a baby. He had no milk, no proper food. He found a small discarded tin in the corner of the cabin, containing a hardened residue of what might have been sweetened condensed milk. He painstakingly scraped it out, mixed it with snow melted by the fire, and strained the thin, watery liquid through a piece of clean cloth. He fashioned a crude teat from a strip of leather, softened by chewing it himself, and attached it to a small flask from his pack. The first attempts at feeding were a disaster. The baby wailed, turning her head away, the strange contraption more insulting than satisfying. But desperation was a powerful teacher. Jedediah persevered his voice, a low, calming rumble, until finally she latched on, suckling weakly at first, then with a growing strength. He named her Ilara. He didn't know why. The name just came to him, whispered on the wind, a soft sound in a hard world. As the days turned into a week, a routine fragile and strange began to form. Jedediah would hunt for small game close to the cabin, never daring to go too far. He learned the rhythm of Ilara's needs, her cries of hunger, her gurgles of contentment, the specific fussiness that meant she needed to be held and walked around the small, warm room. The cabin, once a symbol of his isolation, became their entire world. His gruff exterior, the armor he had built around his heart, began to crack and fall away. He found himself smiling at her when she gripped his finger with her impossibly strong little hand. He would make foolish faces to try and coax a gummy smile from her. He would sing old, forgotten lullabies in his rough baritone, the melodies clumsy, but filled with a tenderness he thought had died in him. One evening, as the winter sun bled purple and orange across the snow-covered peaks, he was holding her by the fire. She was awake, her eyes a deep and startling blue, fixed on his face. She had been making small, cooing sounds for a few days, the precursors to speech. He was tracing the line of her small chin with his finger. "You're a tough one, little Ilara," he said softly. "A real fighter." She watched his mouth, her own lips moving silently, mimicking him. He smiled. "That's me," he said, tapping his own chest. "Papa." He wasn't sure why he said it. It felt both foreign and deeply natural on his tongue. It was a name he thought he would never hear. Ilara's blue eyes were wide with concentration. Her brow furrowed. She took a small, gurgling breath, her mouth forming a perfect O. And then, clear as a breaking dawn, she said it. A soft, breathy sound that pierced the silence of the cabin and the winter of his soul. "Papa." It wasn't a question. It was a statement, a declaration. In her world, a world that had begun in ice and fire, he was the fixed point. He was the source of warmth, food, and safety. He was Papa. Spring hadn't even hinted at its arrival. The snow was still piled high against the door. But in the heart of Jedediah Stone, the thaw had already begun. The utterance of that single word, Papa, irrevocably altered the landscape of Jedediah's existence. It was an anchor mooring him to a responsibility he had never sought, but now could not imagine forsaking. The weeks that followed were a testament to this new reality. The trapper, once a phantom of the high peaks, became a father, his world shrinking to the four walls of the cabin and the small, growing life within it. He became an expert in the language of Ilara's cries. He learned to distinguish the sharp, demanding wail of hunger from the fretful whimper of discomfort. He fashioned a proper cradle from a salvaged crate, lining it with the softest furs. He even managed to trade a few silver fox pelts, the original purpose of his journey. now a distant memory, with a travelling Ute brave he encountered, bartering not for bullets or beans, but for 2 goats. The nanny goat, to his immense relief, was in milk, and Alara thrived on the rich, warm nourishment. Their life was an island of peace in a sea of wilderness. Mornings were for milking the goat and stoking the fire. Afternoons were for short, cautious hunting trips. Alara strapped to his chest in a makeshift papoose, her wide, blue eyes taking in the stark, white world. Evenings were for stories by the fire. Jedediah recounting tales of his own youth, his voice losing its gravelly edge, smoothed by the simple act of speaking to someone who listened without judgment. He was happier than he had been in years, a quiet, fragile happiness that he was terrified to break. But the world outside their small sanctuary had not disappeared. As the first signs of the thaw began to manifest, the slow dripping of melting icicles from the eaves, the distant call of a returning bird. The need for supplies became pressing. The condensed milk was long gone. His flour was running low, and Alara would soon need more than just a rotation of his own softened shirts. With a heavy heart, Jedediah knew he had to go to the nearest settlement, a ramshackle mining town called Whispering Gulch, a good day's ride away. The thought filled him with a gnawing anxiety. Leaving Alara even for a day felt like leaving a part of his own soul behind. And taking her into a town full of prying eyes and gossiping tongues seemed just as dangerous. The mystery of her origins. The blood stain on the floor, the missing mother, was a dark cloud on the horizon of their peaceful existence. He eventually decided he had no choice. He would leave at first light and ride Boudica hard, aiming to be back before nightfall. He asked his Ute acquaintance, a man named Black Eagle, whom he had come to trust to watch over the cabin from a distance. In his absence, a request Black Eagle accepted with a silent, understanding nod. Whispering Gulch was exactly as he remembered it, a muddy main street, carved between a collection of clapboard buildings, 3 saloons for every one church, and the constant rhythmic clang of the mining operations that were the town's lifeblood. The faces he saw were hard and weary men, chasing a fortune that always seemed just out of reach. He tied Boudica outside the general store, feeling the weight of curious stares. Jedediah Stone was a known figure, but a distant one. His sudden reappearance after a long winter was cause for notice. Inside the store smelled of sawdust, coffee, and cured meats. He quickly gathered his supplies, flour, salt-dried beans, and bolts of soft flannel. It was as he was paying the proprietor, a portly man named Silas Abernathy, that the first tendrils of trouble found him. "Good to see you, Stone," Abernathy said, his eyes lingering on the flannel. "Heard you were wintering up in the high country. Must have been a rough one." "It had its moments," Jedediah replied, his tone clipped. "Funny thing," Abernathy continued, leaning conspiratorially over the counter. "You ain't the only one been asking about folks up in them mountains. Had a fella in here about a month back, a slick-looking type, not from around here. Asked if anyone had seen a woman and a newborn baby. Said they went missing just before that first big storm hit." Jedediah's blood ran cold. He kept his face a mask of indifference, carefully counting his change. "People go missing all the time." "Aye, but this was different." Abernathy lowered his voice. "This fella offered a reward, a big one. $500. Said the woman was his sister-in-law, Amelia Vance, and the baby his niece. Said her husband, a wealthy man back east, was going out of his mind with worry." Amelia Vance. The name echoed in the sudden silence of Jedediah's mind. It felt real. It felt dangerous. Did he find them? Jedediah asked, his voice steady, despite the hammering in his chest. Abernathy shook his head. Nope. He hired some trackers, but the storm had buried any sign. Then he left town, said he'd be back in the spring to search again. Left a poster with the sheriff. Jedediah's transaction was finished. He nodded curtly and turned to leave, his mind racing. He had to see the poster. He had to know what he was up against. The sheriff's office was a small, dusty building at the end of the street. Behind the desk sat Sheriff Brody, a man whose weary eyes had seen too much of the desperation that fueled towns like this. He was a fair man, but a shrewd one. Stone. Brody greeted him with a nod, surprise evident on his face. What brings you down from your mountain trot? Just getting supplies, Sheriff. Jedediah said, his gaze sweeping the office until it landed on a notice nailed to the wall. It was a missing persons poster. A crudely drawn sketch of a woman's face was at the top. She was young, with large eyes and a gentle mouth. Below it, the text read, Missing Amelia Vance and infant daughter. Last seen leaving Breckenridge area heading west. Amelia is 22 years of age, fair complexion, brown hair. Information leading to their safe return will be rewarded with the sum of $500. Contact Silas Kane. Silas Kane. Not a concerned husband, a brother-in-law. The name sounded cold, sharp, like the edge of a knife. You interested in that bounty? Sheriff Brody asked, following his gaze. Just curious. Jedediah lied, turning back to face him. Tragedy. Brody sighed, leaning back in his chair. That it is. The fella Kane was an odd sort, dressed like a Pinkerton man, but his eyes were all wrong. Too hungry. Seemed more interested in the information than the safe return, if you catch my meaning. Jedediah's heart sank. Brody was sharp. He'd noticed it too. He said the woman's husband is a man of means. Brody continued. His eyes narrowed slightly, studying Jedediah. Makes you wonder why she'd be traveling alone with a newborn in the dead of winter. It was the question Jedediah had been asking himself for months. The world's full of mysteries, Sheriff, Jedediah said, tipping his hat. He turned to leave the weight of the flannel in his sack, suddenly feeling like a ton of bricks. It was evidence of a child he was hiding. Stone. Brody's voice stopped him at the door. Jedediah turned back. You're buying an awful lot of flannel for a man who lives alone. The sheriff said, his voice quiet, not accusatory, but laced with a sharp, undeniable curiosity. And you look different, less haunted. Jedediah's carefully constructed wall of composure threatened to crumble. He met the sheriff's gaze, his own eyes betraying nothing. Winter changes a man, Brody. That it does, the sheriff agreed slowly. Just make sure it's for the better. Riding back to the cabin, Jedediah pushed Boudica harder than he should have. The fragile piece of his world had been shattered. A shadow had fallen over it, a shadow with a name, Silas Kane. And he was coming back. The $500 reward would bring every desperate man in the territory, sniffing around the mountains. He was no longer just a father. He was a man with a secret that could get him and the child he loved killed. While Jedediah was building a new life in the isolated warmth of the cabin, the man named Silas Kane was carving a path of cold purpose across the thawing territory. Kane was not a man of the West. He was a creature of the East's grimy, ambition-fueled cities, a place where fortunes were made not with pickaxes, but with whispers, threats, and the timely removal of obstacles. He was tall and impeccably dressed for a man on the frontier. His dark coat tailored his boots, polished a stark contrast to the mud and grime of the towns he passed through. But it was his eyes that set him apart. They were the color of a winter sky, pale and devoid of warmth, and they missed nothing. He moved with the predatory grace of a wolf, his politeness a thin veneer over a core of chilling ruthlessness. Sheriff Brody had been right. Silas Kane was not a concerned relative. He was a hunter, and his prey was a baby. The story he told was plausible enough. He was the brother of the esteemed Alistair Vance of Boston, a man of industry and old money. Alistair's young wife Amelia, a woman of simple country origins, had been suffering from a bout of melancholy after the birth of their daughter. In a fit of delusion, she had fled their comfortable home, taking the child with her, seeking the familiar solace of the mountains where she grew up. The family was, of course, devastated and wanted only for their safe return. It was a lie woven with just enough truth to be effective. Amelia was from the Colorado Territory, but she was not Alistair Vance's wife. She had been his mistress, a brief, passionate affair that had resulted in an inconvenient and potentially scandalous consequence, a child. Elara. Alistair Vance, a man obsessed with his public image and controlled by a formidable, unforgiving father, had no intention of acknowledging the child. But the existence of a direct blood heir, even an illegitimate one, could complicate the vast Vance inheritance. The family patriarch had dispatched Silas Alistair's younger, more adaptable brother with a simple, unspoken directive: handle it. Make the problem disappear. Silas had found Amelia in a small boarding house in Breckenridge. He had offered her money, a chance to start a new life elsewhere, as long as she signed away any claim the child might have. Amelia, fierce and protective of her daughter, had refused. She had seen the coldness in Silas's eyes and knew he was not there to negotiate. She had fled, taking Elara into the mountains, hoping to lose herself in the wilderness she knew so well. It was a fatal miscalculation. Silas, an expert tracker of a different sort, had pursued her. He found her taking refuge in the old line shack, just as the blizzard hit. The confrontation was brief and brutal. The bloodstain Jedediah had found was Amelia's. Silas had taken what he came for, a small silver locket from around Amelia's neck, proof that he had found her, and left her for dead, assuming the newborn would quickly succumb to the cold. He had set the fire to burn the cabin down and cover his tracks, but the wet wood and gathering snow had smothered the flames, leaving only a wisp of smoke. An oversight that now gnawed at him. His return in the spring was not to search, but to confirm. He needed to ensure there were no loose ends. The story of the missing mother and child, along with the reward, was a brilliant piece of misdirection. It allowed him to ask questions and canvass the area openly, turning the local populace into his unwitting eyes and ears. Anyone who might have stumbled upon the cabin would be drawn out by the lure of the bounty. His first stop was Whispering Gulch, where he once again conferred with Sheriff Brody. "Any news, Sheriff?" Silas asked, his tone one of weary concern. "Nothing yet, Mr. Kane," Brody said, watching him carefully. "The snow's been deep, but folks are starting to move around again. Word is out about your reward." "Excellent. My family is most anxious," Silas replied smoothly. He then moved on to Abernathy's general store, buying a few provisions, and casually probing the proprietor for any news, any strange rumors, any talk of lone trappers coming down from the mountains. Abernathy, eager to be of service to a wealthy man, mentioned Jedediah Stone. "Just the one fella, a trapper named Stone. Came in a few weeks back." First time anyone's seen him since last fall. Bought a curious amount of flannel. Silas's senses went on high alert. Flannel for a trapper. My thought exactly. Abernathy preened. Sheriff noticed it too. A lone man isolated all winter suddenly in need of soft cloth. It was a thread, a tiny improbable thread, but it was more than he'd had before. Silas paid for his goods, a cold smile touching his lips for the first time. This trapper Stone, Silas said, his voice casual. Where does he keep his cabin? Lord only knows. Abernathy chuckled. Somewhere up in the San Juans. Keeps to himself, that was. 1. A man with a dark past, they say. A dark past. That was useful. A man with a history would be easier to discredit or dispose of if necessary. Silas didn't hire local trackers this time. He was the tracker. He left Whispering Gulch and began his own methodical sweep of the mountains, starting from the area where he had last seen Amelia. He was patient, meticulous. He looked for old tracks, for signs of a path used more than it should be, for any anomaly in the landscape. Days turned into a week. He investigated old mining camps, abandoned shacks, and natural shelters. He was growing frustrated, the vastness of the wilderness mocking his urban sensibilities. He was about to give up on the northern range when he found it. It wasn't a footprint. It was a goat. He saw it grazing on a high-altitude meadow where the snow had melted to reveal the first green shoots of spring. A domestic goat was out of place here. Wild mountain goats were common, but this was a nanny goat with a crude bell around her neck. And where there was livestock, there were people. He tethered his horse and proceeded on foot, moving with a predator's silence. He followed the goat's tracks, which led him towards a thick stand of pine. Through the trees he saw it. The cabin. The very same one. A thin plume of smoke rose from its chimney, a confirmation of life. A cold, triumphant certainty settled over him. The baby had survived. That stubborn, inconvenient child was in there. And with her, a witness. This trapper Stone had just promoted himself from a potential informant to a liability that needed to be erased. He retreated into the woods, finding a vantage point on a ridge overlooking the cabin. He pulled a spyglass from his saddlebag and watched. He saw Jedediah emerge from the cabin, a strapping, weathered man who looked as much a part of the mountains as the trees. He watched him chop wood, his movements economical and strong. He was capable, dangerous. Then he saw Jedediah go back inside, only to emerge a few moments later with a bundle strapped to his chest. Silas focused the spyglass. He could see the top of a small head, a wisp of blonde hair peeking out from the furs. The child. A wave of fury, cold and sharp, washed over Silas. This filthy backwoods trapper had his prize. This man stood between him and the completion of his task, between him and the favor of the Vance family. He lowered the spyglass, his mind already working, formulating a plan. A direct assault would be foolish. The man had a rifle and knew the terrain. No, this required something more refined. He would wait. He would watch. He would learn the man's routines. And when the moment was right, he would descend not as a brute, but as a serpent, and reclaim what was his, ensuring that this time the silence of the snow would be permanent. The hunter had found his quarry. The siege was about to begin. The fragile peace that Jedediah had cultivated was now a constant low-grade hum of anxiety. He felt the weight of unseen eyes on him, the paranoia a bitter taste in his mouth. He patrolled the perimeter of his small domain with a rifle in hand, his senses on a knife's edge. Every snapped twig, every shadow that moved in the periphery, sent a jolt of fear through him, not for himself, but for the precious life that now depended entirely on him. He was haunted by the name on the poster, Amelia Vance. Who was she? Why had she fled into a blizzard with her newborn child? Was she a victim or something else? He looked at Elara, at her bright, trusting blue eyes, and saw the ghost of the woman from the crude sketch. His search for answers began inside the cabin itself. He had, in his initial frantic efforts to save Elara, simply pushed aside the bundle of furs and rags she'd been found in. Now he examined them with the care of an archaeologist. They were a sad collection, a few worn woolen blankets, a rabbit fur wrap, and the thin linen shift she had worn. Tucked into a fold of one of the blankets, his fingers found something hard and small. It was a pouch made of soft doeskin, the drawstring pulled tight. With trembling hands he opened it. Inside were 2 items. The first was a small, intricately carved wooden bird, clearly a handmade token smoothed by frequent handling. A mother's gift, he surmised. The second item made his heart stop. It was a locket, silver tarnished by the elements, but clearly of fine craftsmanship. It was the kind of thing a wealthy family would own. His fingers, clumsy and thick, struggled with the clasp. When it finally sprang open, he stared at the face within. It was her, the woman from the poster. But the crude sketch had done her no justice. In the tiny hand-tinted photograph, Amelia Vance was beautiful. Her hair was a cascade of dark curls. Her eyes held a hint of defiance, and a small, sad smile played on her lips. She was looking at someone or something out of frame, a look of profound, secret love in her eyes. On the opposite side of the locket, where a husband's picture should be, was a delicate engraving, a single intertwined A and E. Amelia and Elara. This was no melancholic, delusional woman. This was a mother who loved her child. The sight of her face, so full of life, contrasted with the grim reality of the blood stain on the floor, cemented a terrible certainty in Jedediah's mind. Amelia Vance hadn't abandoned her baby. She had died defending her. The discovery of the locket created a new painful conflict in his soul. He now had proof of Elara's identity. The honorable thing to do would be to take this to Sheriff Brody, to try and find her family, to return her to the life of wealth and privilege that was her birthright. The Mr. Alistair Vance of Boston could give her everything Jedediah could not. Fine clothes, a grand house and education. But the thought of giving her up was a physical agony. Elara wasn't just a baby, he had found. She was his daughter in every way that mattered. She was the one who had thawed his frozen heart, who had given his desolate life purpose. The thought of her being raised by strangers by the cold-eyed Silas Kane, and a father who hadn't even come to search for her himself, was unbearable. He pictured handing her over. He saw her small hand reaching for him, her blue eyes wide with confusion, her voice calling "Papa" as he walked away. The image was a knife in his gut. He couldn't do it. He wouldn't. This decision, made in the fire-lit warmth of the cabin, solidified his resolve. He wasn't just hiding her anymore. He was protecting her. He was her father, and he would fight for her. This new purpose gave him a new clarity. He had to assume Silas Kane was already out there hunting. He had to be smarter, more careful. He began to vary his routines. He checked his traps at irregular hours. He never used the same path twice. He reinforced the cabin door with a heavy wooden bar and fashioned a new, sturdier shutter for the window. He also began to prepare for a siege. He stockpiled firewood and smoked the meat from a deer he managed to bring down. He filled every available container with fresh water from the stream. The cabin was no longer just a home. It was a fortress. During this time, Elara grew and thrived, oblivious to the storm gathering around them. She was crawling now, exploring the small cabin with an insatiable curiosity. Her gurgles and coos had turned into a stream of babble, with "Papa" being the most frequent and cherished word. She was a beacon of light in the growing darkness of Jedediah's world. One afternoon, while he was outside splitting wood, keeping a constant watch on the surrounding forest, he saw something that confirmed his worst fears. High on the ridge opposite the cabin, a flash of light. It was the sun glinting off something metal, a spyglass. Jedediah didn't react. He didn't look up. He continued to chop the wood, as if he had seen nothing, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. He finished his task, gathered the wood, and went back inside, barring the door behind him. He was being watched. The hunter was no longer a vague threat, a name on a poster in a distant town. He was here. He was close. The fragile bubble of their existence had been pierced. The shadow he had feared was no longer looming. It was crouched at his door, waiting. The time for hiding was over. The time for a confrontation was drawing terrifyingly near. The discovery that he was being watched plunged Jedediah into a state of heightened, nerve-wracking vigilance. The game had changed. It was no longer a matter of if Silas Cain would make his move, but when and how. For 3 days, an unnerving silence hung over the valley. Jedediah saw no more glints of light from the ridge, no sign of movement in the trees. This absence of activity was more terrifying than the surveillance itself. It meant Cain was patient. It meant he was planning. Jedediah kept Elara inside the cabin, now feeling less like a fortress and more like a cage. He slept in short, fitful bursts, his rifle never leaving his side. The waiting was a form of torture, fraying his nerves raw. The confrontation came not with the thunder of a gunshot, but with the subtlety of a serpent. It was late afternoon on the 4th day. The sun was beginning its descent, painting the sky in hues of orange and rose. Elara was asleep in her cradle. A sudden sharp bleating from outside broke the quiet. It was the goat, a sound of distress. Jedediah's every instinct screamed that it was a trap. Cain was trying to draw him out. He peered through a tiny crack in the window shutter. He could see the goat, its leg caught in a snare that hadn't been there that morning. It was a cruel, deliberate bait. He was torn. Leaving the goat to suffer was against his nature, but leaving the cabin meant leaving Elara vulnerable. He looked at her sleeping so peacefully, and his decision was made. He would not be drawn out. He waited, his rifle aimed at the door, his heart a cold, heavy stone in his chest. An hour passed, then another. The sun dipped below the peaks and long purple shadows crept across the snow. Then a voice from outside, calm and unnervingly polite. "Mr. Stone, Jedediah Stone. My name is Silas Cain. I know you're in there. I also know you have my niece. I mean you no harm. I simply want to talk." Jedediah remained silent, his knuckles white on the stock of his rifle. "I can see you're a cautious man." The voice continued closer now, just outside the door. "I admire that. But this situation is untenable. You cannot hide here forever. The girl belongs with her family. A very wealthy, very powerful family, who will not stop looking for her. She's got family right here." Jedediah growled, his voice low and dangerous. A soft chuckle from outside. A kidnapper who fancies himself a father. A noble sentiment, but one that will not hold up in any court. I have a legal claim, Mr. Stone. You have nothing but a stolen child. I found her left for dead, Jedediah retorted, his anger flaring. Left by you. The silence that followed this accusation was brief but heavy. You're mistaken, Cain said, his voice losing its silken edge, replaced by a chilling coldness. Her mother Amelia was a troubled woman. She ran off in the storm. I tracked her here, but I was too late. She was gone, and the child had succumbed to the cold. I left to get help to arrange a proper burial. Imagine my surprise when I hear rumors of a reclusive trapper suddenly buying baby supplies. It was a masterful lie, twisting the truth into a weapon. Cain was painting Jedediah as the villain, the opportunistic scavenger. Now, Cain continued, his tone shifting back to one of reason. Let's be practical. You are a man of limited means. I represent a family of infinite resources. You cannot give the child the life she deserves. I can. I am prepared to be generous. Walk out of there, leave the child, and I will give you the $500 reward plus another $500 for your trouble. $1,000, Mr. Stone. You could disappear, start a new life free of this complication. The offer hung in the air, a tempting poison. $1,000 was a fortune, more money than Jedediah had ever seen. It was a path back to a life of solitude, free of fear and pursuit. But then he heard a small whimper from the cradle. Elara was stirring. He looked over at her innocent, sleeping face, and the temptation vanished, replaced by a fierce, protective rage. Go to hell, Jedediah said, his voice flat and final. Another sigh from outside the door. A pity. I truly hoped to resolve this amicably. But if you insist on being difficult... The next sound was not at the door. It was from the roof, a scraping, shuffling sound. Cain wasn't trying to break the door down. He was on the roof, heading for the chimney. Jedediah realized his plan with a surge of horror. Cain was going to block the chimney to smoke them out like rats in a hole. He scrambled to the hearth, his mind racing. He couldn't let the fire go out. The cabin would be plunged into a freezing darkness. But if Cain blocked the chimney, the room would fill with smoke in minutes. He looked around desperately. His eyes landed on the small keg of lantern oil in the corner. An idea reckless and desperate formed in his mind. You're a fool, Stone. Cain's voice echoed faintly from the roof. You can't win. Jedediah worked quickly. He doused a thick rag in the oil. He heard a heavy canvas being draped over the chimney opening. Instantly, smoke began to billow back into the room, acrid and choking. Elara woke up and began to cry, her wails turning into coughs. It's all right, little one. Jedediah coughed, his eyes stinging. Papa's here. With no time to spare, he lit the oil-soaked rag, creating a makeshift torch. He ran to the door, his other hand holding his rifle. He took a deep breath, kicked the heavy bar away, and threw the door open, charging out into the twilight. He expected Cain to be on the roof, but the man was faster, more agile than he'd anticipated. Silas Cain was standing 10 feet away, having slid down the steep roof pitch, a sophisticated-looking revolver already in his hand. He was smiling a predator's smile of absolute confidence. Brave, Cain said, raising his pistol, but foolish. He didn't fire at Jedediah. He fired at the oil-soaked torch that Jedediah had dropped by the doorframe. The torch exploded in a whoosh of flame, igniting the dry wood of the doorframe instantly. The fire, hungry after a long winter, licked up the wall of the cabin with terrifying speed. "Now," Silas Kane said, the flames dancing in his cold eyes, his pistol still aimed squarely at Jedediah. "The cabin burns. The child tragically perishes in the fire along with her kidnapper. A neat, clean end to a messy affair. Give her to me, Stone, and I might just let you run." The cabin, his home, his fortress, Elara's entire world was being consumed by fire. The smoke was pouring from the doorway. He could hear Elara's terrified screams from within. He was caught between a devil and a fire of his own making, with everything he had come to love trapped in the inferno. The world narrowed to the roaring fire, the screaming child, and the cold smile of Silas Kane. There was no choice. Love for the child he called his own eclipsed all instinct for survival. Jedediah feinted toward Kane, then spun and plunged back into the choking, fiery hell of the cabin. "I'm coming, Elara!" He roared, his voice raw. He snatched the terrified, coughing child from her cradle, wrapped her in a blanket, and smashed his way through the rear window. He scrambled out into the cold night air, just as a bullet from Kane's revolver splintered the wood where his head had been. Clasping Elara tight, Jedediah fled into the familiar darkness of the pine forest. The burning cabin, casting ghastly, flickering shadows. He couldn't outrun him. Kane was relentless, his bullets whizzing past in the dark. Spotting a jumble of granite boulders, Jedediah dove behind them, settling Elara into a sheltered crevice. He knew he couldn't win a prolonged shootout. Using his knowledge of the terrain, he laid down cover fire and scrambled through a shallow ravine he knew well, circling around on his opponent. He emerged from the shadows behind Kane. "It's over," he rasped. Kane spun, shock twisting his features, but Jedediah was on him, bringing his rifle butt down on Kane's arm with a sickening crack. The pistol flew into the snow. The two men fell to the ground in a desperate, brutal brawl. Jedediah, fueled by a father's primal rage, fought with a strength that overwhelmed the sleeker man. Suddenly, a voice cut through the night. "Hold it right there." Sheriff Brody stood at the edge of the clearing, his shotgun leveled, drawn by the blaze that lit up the night sky. "Sheriff, thank God." Kane gasped, clutching his broken arm. "This man, Stone. He kidnapped my niece." Brody's gaze was hard, moving from the snarling Kane to the exhausted Jedediah, who now held the crying Elara. "Funny," Brody said, his voice like iron. "A man trying to rescue his niece usually doesn't shoot at her." As his deputy retrieved Kane's fallen pistol, something else was spotted in the snow. It was the silver locket. Brody opened it, saw Amelia's face, and his suspicions solidified into certainty. This belonged to her mother. Strange you'd be carrying it, Kane, unless you were the last one to see her alive. The lie shattered. Kane, exposed and defeated, was taken into custody. The full, ugly truth of the Vance family's greed would eventually come to light, but Jedediah's world had already become quiet again. He had lost his home, but as he held Elara, he knew he had lost nothing of value. Spring came, and with the thaw, a new beginning. With Sheriff Brody's help, Jedediah Stone became the legal guardian of Elara Stone. They built a new cabin on a sunny slope, a home founded not on solitude but on love. He would tell Elara stories of her first mother, the brave Amelia, who gave her life for her daughter. But as she grew, her hand held securely in his, there was only one name she ever called him. Papa. From the brink of a frozen death, a new life blossomed. From the ashes of a lonely existence, a family was forged. The story of Jedediah and Elara is a powerful reminder that sometimes the family we choose is bound by ties stronger than blood. It's a testament to the fact that even in the harshest of winters, the warmth of love can bring about the most impossible spring. Their journey was one of survival sacrifice and the quiet, fierce love of a father who found his entire world in the eyes of a child he was never meant to have. If their story touched your heart and reminded you of the power of human connection, please help us share it with the world. Hit that like button to let us know it resonated with you. Share this video with someone who appreciates a story of true heart and grit, and most importantly, subscribe to our channel for more tales of history, heroism, and the moments that define our humanity. Join our community and never miss a story. Thank you for listening.